A former nurse has been charged with 8 counts of murder and 10 counts of attempted murder following an investigation into baby deaths at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
The following stories tell the tale of 3 psychotic killers that were still taking people's lives a few years ago. This case takes us all the way back to 1993 in Glenview, Illinois. It was a peaceful Cook County village where teens would hang out with their neighbors outside their homes. The crime rates were very low, and parents were happy to let their kids go out freely. But on August 14th, 1993, one man walked out into his front yard when he saw his daughter's body laying in a pool of blood in the bushes.
I was the one who found her. I woke up and I had a cup of coffee and I was going out to my van. And I just happened to see 2 little tennis shoes sticking up by the side door. And when I saw it was her, I dropped the coffee cup.
It was 18-year-old Trisha Paciaccio. She was a fun, loving high school girl who was kind to everyone and had no enemies. No one understood why anyone would do such a horrible thing to her. She had been multiple times in a very violent way.
I was the first responder to the scene back on 1993. I walked to the south side of the home, and that's where I saw the victim lying on the ground near the garage. She had a lot of blood on her shirt or her blouse. At that time, I was guessing she was numerous times.
The police knew they were looking for a psychotic killer who was capable of very violent outbursts. No one was known to behave like that in Trisha's close circle, but the investigators rounded up about 15 suspects, all people who Trisha or her family knew at the time. One of them was Michael Gargiulo, a friend of Trisha's brother Doug. As soon as the police started asking him questions, he began acting strangely.
Mike Gargiulo is a very powerful young man, and he flat refused to cooperate with the police. The state's attorney's office, they wanted more than we had at that time.
The police couldn't arrest Michael as they didn't have enough evidence, but he kept sending out red flags. The first one to notice them was Scott, Mike's childhood friend. He says that Mike always had 2 sides. One is the shy, awkward teen.
The other side of Mike was he had what I call the crazy switch, where if he really wanted something, and he was going to get it one way or another, and he flipped the switch. All emotions, gone.
But he rarely showed this to anyone in his circle, Trisha's family included. Mike would often come to their house to hang out with Doug and their other friends. Trisha's parents only saw the quiet guy in the background.
I knew him to be very quiet, one of the guys that were in the back. He was never loud or boisterous whatsoever.
Mike, Doug, and Scott had actually driven Trisha home 2 days before Mike stabbed her to death. Absolutely no one suspected him for it. Until about a year later, when he started making grand gestures for Trisha's family.
First started with the flower.
He brought Diane flowers.
I'm like, why is Michael bringing us? It was live greenery. At Easter time, he brought us a lily. He brought us a dinner certificate to a restaurant, and then he even brought him a shirt.
According to criminal psychologists, murderers sometimes do this to try and atone for their deeds.
One of the psychologists that was talking to us says he's trying to expiate his sin. He's trying to atone for his crime with the presents that he was giving to family.
But the more Mike gave to the Paciaccios, the more attention he drew to himself. Soon enough, the police were on his tail. For the next few years, the Illinois police tried to get enough evidence to arrest Mike, and Mike tried to dodge them. One of his methods was redirecting the police's attention onto his friends, including Doug, Trisha's brother.
And he looked at me and he said, if you knew who did this, would you kill them or could you kill them? I said, well, what do you think? Ask any father, any brother, anybody. I think you know the answer. The police called me later on, Detective Jack Reed, and said, do you realize that Michael Gargiulo called us and told us that you threatened him?
Mike even tried to frame his friend Eric for the crime.
He attempted at that time to lay all the suspicion on his doorstep by telling us that the morning after the murder, Eric came to his home and asked him to come along so he could hide something, a gym bag. We asked Mike Gargiulo what was inside the bag. I have no idea.
But once the police figured out Eric was innocent, Mike came into the spotlight again. Finally, in 1998, he fled to Los Angeles. Unfortunately, this was no clean slate for him. His crimes would only get more and more gruesome. In 2001, Mike set his eyes on Ashley Ellerin. She was a 22-year-old fashion design student from a tiny Northern California town. She had come to LA to study and make it big on the Hollywood scene.
She liked to have fun?
Absolutely.
We liked to have fun. We had a lot of fun.
Ashley and her friends would often get together late at night and party at LA's hottest clubs. In February 2001, Ashley caught the eye of 23-year-old Ashton Kutcher. He was one of Hollywood's young and promising actors at the time, and Ashley quickly recognized him, and they started talking. Before long, Ashton asked her out.
We had hung out with him a couple of times. They had, maybe gone out on a couple dates or whatever.
On February 21st, at around 10:45 p.m., Ashton drove to Ashley's home to pick her up and take her to the Grammys party. But Ashley wouldn't answer the door. Ashton waited for a bit, then drove off. Before he left, he took a brief look through the window and saw what he thought was spilled wine on the floor. Tragically, it wasn't wine. Ashton didn't think much of it at that time, but soon enough, Ashley's roommate found her dead body lying in a pool of...
I entered the house. There was 2 steps to the left here, and Ashley was laying across the 2 stairs, absolutely blue and covered in...
She'd been stabbed 47 times, even worse than Trisha. One of the stabs in the neck almost severed her head. Another stab wound to the head went into her skull, taking out a chunk of her skull. It was the worst the LA police detectives had ever seen.
A lot of anger, a lot of rage. Somebody had isolated Ashley Ellerin to kill her and was very, very angry when he did it. It just was a very bad scene. Probably one of the worst I've seen.
But just like in Illinois, Mike left no evidence behind. The only clue was a strange story from a few months prior to the murder. Mike had rang Ashley's doorbell and introduced himself as a heating and air guy, a repairman. He did end up repairing Ashley and her friend's heater and spooked them out with strange stories about how he's a professional boxer. Mike had been an amateur boxer and now was working as a repairman in LA with dreams of making it in the big scene as an actor.
Is your name?
Mike Gargiulo.
During the early 2000s, he appeared as a boxer in someone's short dissertation film. With no clues to follow, Ashley's case, just like Trisha's, went cold. But in 2005, the LA police were notified of yet another dead body, matching the killer's type, young, attractive women. 32-year-old Maria Bruno was found dead at her El Monte apartment, just a few doors away from Mike's apartment.
This is a building where the murder happened. Behind me in apartment number 20 is where Maria Bruno lived.
So he kind of has a pretty clear shot if he's looking through the window right down to her place.
He has a very clear shot at her front door and both living room window and the kitchen window.
Maria was a mother of 4 from El Salvador. She had recently separated from her husband, who had taken custody of their children. On December 1st, 2005, Mike squeezed into her flat, through her window, and stabbed her 17 times while she was sleeping.
After she was dead, her body was somewhat mutilated, and you just, that's crap you see in the movies. In real life, that is very rare. It just doesn't happen.
Once again, he left no relevant clues at the scene, but the police started connecting the victims. They were 3 young and defenseless women who were attacked in their homes. While the police were desperately looking for suspects, Mike was planning to kill again, but this time, his plan would fail dramatically. On April 28, 2008, just before midnight, Mike entered the home of his neighbor, Michelle Murphy.
Proceeds into the bedroom where she's sleeping, and what awakes her is a knife being plunged into her.
Michelle was stabbed several times in her chest, shoulder, and right arm before she managed to grab Mike's knife and throw it away. Michelle kicked him in the chest with her feet, and that's when he fled the scene.
Did he say anything to her ever?
I'm sorry.
He said, "I'm sorry."
I'm sorry.
This time, Mike left his blood at the scene. 3 weeks after the stabbing, a DNA sample came back from the lab, and the police finally had their killer. 24 hours later, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder. In the next few months, Detective Richard Lewis and his team connected Mike to all of his murders: Trisha, Ashley, and Maria. From the very first time he got arrested, Mike asked Richard, "Which agency is this?"
That tells me a lot. It tells me that he wasn't sure of which crime he's getting charged for.
The DNA sample now helped connect the 3 LA cases, but in Trisha's case, there was something else.
While watching that episode of 48 Hours, a viewer who years earlier had worked with Michael Gargiulo in a Los Angeles nightclub remembered that Gargiulo had once bragged to him and others that he had killed a young woman in Chicago.
Finally, on July 7th, 2011, he was charged with Trisha's murder. His trials for the other murders were delayed over and over again, but in 2019 he was convicted on all counts, with Ashton Kutcher testifying against him. In 2021, he was sentenced to death. Our last story begins way down south in Louisiana, and it's the most gruesome one yet. Ronald Dominique was born on January 9th, 1964, in this quiet 15,000 people place. He lived with his parents and older sister in a trailer park on the outskirts of the city. Ronald grew up in poverty, and he'd always had a weight problem. At school, he would often be bullied as a result of this. His colleagues described him as melancholic, quiet, and suffering from low self-esteem. Shortly before leaving school, Ronald also discovered he was gay, and he started visiting a local gay bar, sometimes singing as a drag queen. Soon enough, he started getting bullied by his former classmates again.
To some degree, Dominique was in a trap. He was stuck with his sexuality, but this was also attracting ridicule from others. There was very little he could do about this, and his struggle to exist under this kind of dominance by others probably made him very frustrated and angry.
Ronald Dominique had an unhappy youth, but what he did next is shocking and unacceptable, even in his case. On August 25th, 1996, a young man jumped out of the window from Ronald's place, shouting to the neighbors that he had been. Dominique had tried to kill him too. Dominique was immediately arrested, but when the case was transferred to the court, the prosecutor's office was unable to locate or identify the victim, and the case was dropped. In July of 1997, the body of 19-year-old David Mitchell was found in the Louisiana canals.
The young black male was found in a canal, a shallow canal, and the coroner ruled his death partially by asphyxia, by drowning.
The police were suspicious of David drowning in such shallow waters, but they didn't have any evidence of foul play. However, over the next few years, the bodies would keep showing up. They were usually African-American men between 16 and 46 years old. The police were clueless. Were these drug hits? Unfortunately, Dominique would target drug addicts and people with a history of drug trafficking or possession.
We thought as though the suspect was targeting vulnerable people, people that didn't have families to go home to, people that just would take a ride from anybody.
He would lure them to his trailer with promises of drugs or a sex party involving his alleged girlfriend. Then he would rape them and strangle them to death. Ronald Dominique killed 23 men in under 10 years. All of them were in the Yuma region, and most of them were thrown into the bayou. Soon enough, people all around Louisiana were aware and afraid of the Bayou Strangler. He continued to baffle the police while they were desperately trying to find a connection between the victims and a motive for the killings.
All of these men were, for all intents and purposes, healthy, fit, young. We knew that whoever was killing them had to be stronger than them to be able to overpower them.
The police had the victim profile, but the killer remained a mystery for 9 years. In November 2006, Dominique tried to strike again. He stopped his van as he saw a man walking along the road. He showed him a picture of a girl and made him a proposition.
He said, you see this girl right here? That's my girlfriend. Look, when she was a kid, she was raped. So she's very scared to have sex, but I think she'd want to have sex with you.
Somehow, he convinced this man, Ricky Wallace, to come to his trailer. There, Dominique wanted to convince him to try bondage, but Ricky refused and left quickly. Ricky reported this creepy event, and the police arrested Dominique and asked him for a blood sample. The domino pieces started falling. His DNA matched the profile found on several of his victims. On December 1st, 2006, after a decade of horrifying crimes, he was finally arrested at a homeless shelter. He'd moved out of his sister's place because he knew his arrest was imminent, and he didn't want to trouble her. Once at the police station, Dominique confessed to all his 23 murders, describing all of their gruesome details to the officers. Even so, he maintained he was innocent. According to him, the victims' addictions and poverty, they voluntarily agreed to be tied and treated badly for money. Dominique received several life sentences in the Louisiana State Penitentiary without the possibility for parole. While this huge list of victims left the police and the community shocked and scared, the case being solved also made them more confident that there is hope for the vulnerable. No one should be scared for their lives. Some serial killers look like psychos straight from horror movies, but some conceal their thoughts and actions behind an innocent-looking face. Lucy Letby was born in 1990 in Herefordshire, UK. She grew up with her parents, Susan and David, as their only child. She attended a comprehensive school in the area, then went on to get her pediatric nursing degree in 2011. From the outside, nothing seems wrong about Lucy or her family. Susan and David are still together, and they all lived in the same house for over 25 years. One of Lucy's neighbors said, "I've seen her grow up. She seemed like a lovely woman." So this news is deeply and utterly shocking. I can't fathom it. When you hear of sorts of things, you always get one or two people saying, "I thought there was something fishy about them." But with Lucy, all you will hear is positive things. Indeed, nothing on Lucy's social media and none of her friends and acquaintances know anything that could act as a sign for what she was about to do. Moreover, Lucy led a classic social life, and her work colleagues, the other nurses and midwives at the Countess of Chester Hospital, described her as an exemplary, hardworking woman. Lucy started working at the Chester Hospital in 2013. Quickly, she became the face of a fundraising initiative called Baby Grow. The hospital wanted to raise £3 million for a new neonatal unit, and Lucy was the perfect employee to show in the papers. Or at least that's what the hospital thought. The caption under her picture said, "My role involves caring for a wide range of babies, requiring various levels of support. Some are here for a few days, others for many months, and I enjoy seeing them progress and supporting their families." But something was off. In 2013, there were 2 infant deaths at the hospital. In 2015, there were 8 deaths. Not only was this an abnormal number of unexplainable deaths, the cause raised some questions too. The premature babies had collapsed with heart and lung failure, but were unusually impossible to resuscitate. Even more concerningly, the babies developed strange blotches on their arms and legs after the futile resuscitation attempts. At least one of the babies developed these blotches on the chest and abdomen as well. So what was happening? Throughout 2016, the hospital's doctors took a high-level thematic review of the cases, but nothing made any sense to them. The more doctors looked into it, the further away they felt from an answer. And while they were investigating the previous cases, 5 more babies died under just as mysterious circumstances. So in 2017, the police were called in to investigate. Meanwhile, the Chester Hospital doctor decided to downgrade the neonatal unit from level 2 to level 1. This means they would no longer accept very premature babies born less than 32 weeks old or babies who needed intensive care. The hospital was afraid that this was what was ruining their numbers, but the truth was a much darker one. In July 3rd, 2018, over 2 years after the hospital started the inquiry into the cases, the police made a breakthrough. They arrested 28-year-old Lucy Letby for the murder of 8 babies and the attempted murder of 6 others. But about 72 hours later, she was released on bail. The police simply didn't have enough evidence to keep her in custody. The police found nothing at her home either. Yes, the babies died during Lucy's shift, but their heart and lung failure couldn't be connected to a clear cause. It is still unclear what Lucy's method or other methods were. But the police didn't give up. Throughout the next year, they probed another 17 infant deaths. Lucy was arrested again in 2019 and was again discharged following insufficient evidence. But in November 2020, Lucy was arrested for the 3rd time.
A former nurse has been charged with 8 counts of murder and 10 counts of attempted murder following an investigation into baby deaths at the Countess of Chester Hospital. 30-year-old Lucy Letby has been rearrested as part of an investigation which began in 2017.
The mounting evidence is still unclear to the public, but it is enough to keep Lucy in jail while she awaits trial.
Cheshire Police say that their investigation has taken so long because it's been highly complex and extremely challenging, and they say that they've consulted a number of medical specialists to ensure that it's been as thorough as possible.
The news shocked her family, her friends, and of course, all of the grieving babies' families. How could a young, apparently caring nurse who once raised funding for the hospital destroy so many lives? How could anyone take the life of a newborn baby who needs medical support? As of March 2022, Lucy awaits trial for her gruesome deeds. So far, she has pleaded not guilty, but the police are confident she won't walk free again.
When he attacked victims and was usually armed with a knife,
he stated, "You know who I am."
So far, police have discovered the skeletal remains of 9 and possibly 10 victims.
Remains of 2 more women.
All worried and freaked out. We haven't heard from her.
My whole body shut down, I was just in shock.
Usually, even the darkest, grimmest cases have some sort of resolution, as the killer is caught and answers are brought to the victims and their families. But sometimes, justice is never served. On the dusty hills of New Mexico, a killer took the lives of several young women, and the police didn't bat an eyelid at the desperate families when they declared them missing. The reason why is even more tragic. In New York, a horrible psychopath lured over a dozen victims to his home through the internet. The bodies would pile up like anyone's worst nightmares, and the media frenzy pushed the killer even further away from the police. And in Sao Paulo, Brazil, a serial killer targeted young gay men. Was this a dark ex-cop with a horrific history? Or were the police oh so very wrong? Watch on to learn about serial killers who might even be killing today. This gruesome story begins on February 2nd, 2009, when a woman was walking her dog in West Mesa, a hilly part of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was a dusty area full of red dirt, cacti, and random rocks sticking out. But there was something else sticking out. When she took a closer look, her blood stood still. It was a human bone. She immediately called 911, and when the police arrived at the scene, they started digging. But the digging took a week. The more they dug, the more remains they'd find. By February 10th, the reality of the situation was a truly horrible one. There were 11 female bodies buried in a giant hole. The Albuquerque police had just about 1,000 questions. Who had done this, and when? Were they still at large? Before long, they had a name for this horrific murderer: the West Mesa Bone Collector. The police also managed to link this case to a cold case that was once assigned to a special agent named Ida. She was handling cold cases back in 2006 or 2007, and she was looking at a long list of women who had disappeared between 2003 and 2006. There was something that connected the women too. They were all illegal night workers, and they all had serious substance abuse issues. Also, all of the disappeared women used to work in a really tough area called the War Zone. The first thing Ida did was start protecting the women working there at the time, in 2007. She made a list connecting all the disappearing cases and tried to take it to her boss, but no one took her seriously. Tragically, this often happens when disappearing cases involve illegal night workers and addicts. But in February 2009, the Albuquerque police began to take Ida's cold case seriously. Now they had uncovered 11 female bodies, and they had to extract them as carefully as they could. This was not an easy task. Hundreds of specialists came to the area, sifting through the dirt and working with their hands so as not to disturb the crime scene or any other potential remains. Some skeletons were buried 8 feet deep and were in almost pristine condition, but the ones in the shallow part of the grave were scattered, bits and pieces mixed up together. It was very difficult to identify which body each bone belonged to. And imagine how gruesome that process was for the specialists involved. Finally, the skeletons reached the lab, and the examiners began identifying the bodies. The first one to be identified through dental records was 26-year-old Victoria Chavez. She had been reporting missing in March 2005, but according to her family, she had been missing for almost a year before they actually rang the police. Just like the other women on Ida's list, Victoria was a night worker, and she had problems with illegal substances. In 2004, she was on probation. By February 18th, 6 women had been identified. At this point, the FBI were also involved, Albuquerque police had asked for their best profilers to help identify victims as well as catch the serial killer. But the specialists were uncovering an even grimier reality. One of the sets of remains had a smaller set of remains inside. This was the body of a pregnant woman, 22-year-old Michelle Valdez. She'd been missing since February 2005. Her family described her as an extremely kind mom, about to be a second mom, who had dreams of becoming a singer. Unfortunately, she had recently become addicted to heavy substances and was struggling to kick the habit. Michelle had started disappearing from home for days, then weeks, then months at a time. But she would always check in with her parents via her phone, letting them know she was away or asking for money. When she disappeared and they couldn't get a hold of her, Michelle's parents rang up the police and declared her missing. But just like in the other cases, they ignored the family's pleas. It gets worse. A few months into Michelle's disappearance, her mother started hearing rumors that she'd been jabbed to death and left in the West Mesa area. This was a rough neighborhood, and people had seen something absolutely vital to the case. But when Michelle's mom went to the police crying and begging them to look into these rumors, they were once again dismissed. It simply seemed like if you hung around the wrong crowd, you weren't worthy of justice. The third woman to be identified was Cinnamon Elks. She was 32 at the time of her disappearance, so when her mother reported her missing, the police basically told her she could do whatever she wanted. She was old enough. It was through Cinnamon that the worst rumors yet were heard. Just before she went off the radar in 2004, she was telling fellow illegal night workers and friends that there was a dirty cop in the area, decapitating illegal night workers and burying them in West Mesa. It was also in August 2004 that 24-year-old Julie Nieto went missing, and among other identified bodies was Monica Candelaria. She was one of the first to disappear back in 2003, and it was then that her family heard rumors that she had been killed and buried in West Mesa. So the rumors had been going around since the first missing cases. Imagine how many murders could have been prevented if the police had listened to the begging families. Now the Albuquerque detectives were uncovering something else. All of these women knew each other, and they were all Hispanic. This meant that they probably all knew the killer personally too. The suspect pool could be getting smaller. The FBI then started working all around the Southwest, tracking down potential leads and connections to this case. In the spring of 2009, another victim was identified, Doreen Marquez. She was an unusual case, as she was a straight-A student who had lived comfortably all her life. In 2004, she was a mom of 2 and happily dating someone. But when he was sent to prison, she spiraled into a life of illegal substances. When she couldn't handle her addiction anymore, she went to prostitution. The list was getting longer. As you can imagine, when 11 bodies were uncovered, this news made the headlines all over New Mexico. Albuquerque police appeared on TV and promised justice for the victims and their families. But the police seemed at a loss about many things. First of all, they couldn't figure out the cause of death for any of the bodies. They had been decomposed for years, and the New Mexico forensics team wasn't sure how to find the cause of death in this case. They even sent the remains to a bigger lab in Texas, but they weren't sure either. In the end, the cause of death for all 11 bodies was ruled out as homicidal violence. That could mean anything.
APD still won't call the West Mesa murders a cold case, but they say they also won't name any suspects involved, and they actually have a bigger pool of people they're looking at than ever before.
Indeed, through 2009, the police started forming a list of suspects. One of them was Lorenzo Montoya. He'd been arrested in 1999 for attempting to strangle an illegal night worker to death, and in 2003 to 2006, he lived awfully close to the large burial site in West Mesa. But here was the catch. Montoya had been in 2006 by the boyfriend of an illegal night worker he'd attacked. His death made him a prime suspect. Remember, in 2006, the murders had stopped. However, this wasn't the end of their suspect list. A second prime suspect was Joseph Blea. When the bodies were uncovered, it was Blea's own ex-wife who reported something strange to the police. Her ex-husband had a huge women's jewelry collection at home, and she had no idea where he'd gotten it from. He also had a big women's underwear collection in their backyard shed. Sheesh. He'd already been arrested for stalking prostitutes and indecent exposure. Then he was linked to violating a 13-year-old girl. He would spend the rest of his life in prison.
Girls in the late 1980s. Investigators say Blea wore a ski mask when he attacked victims and was usually armed with a knife.
Blea is also a suspect in a very large case that's gained national attention. As we've learned and reported last year, Blea is a suspect in the West Mesa murders.
There was a third suspect, Scott Kimball. He was a notorious criminal who was released by the FBI in 2002 so that he could act as an informant, but he went on a killing spree instead.
So there's never a time that you say, okay, I won against Scott Kimball. It's going to be an ongoing investigation with him probably for the rest of my career.
He killed at least 4 people between 2002 and 2005, until his arrest and life in prison sentence. And in 2010, a private detective called George Walker received the creepiest phone call.
He stated, "You know who I am." And I said, bingo.
You know who I am. I know Nina. I know who killed her. I know who did it. And I know why. Okay, bye.
But as frustrating as it is, this phone call could not be tracked, and it proved to be a dead end. It could have been a prank call, someone wanting to steal the spotlight for a few seconds, or it could have been something much darker. To this day, over a decade from the discovery of the burial sites, the police are far away from tracking down the killer. In fact, there could even be more bodies out there. Between 2001 and 2006, 16 cases of disappearing illegal night workers were reported. Only 11 bodies were found.
Knew that one day they could be digging again for more of the victims.
The similarities are pretty close, so I think any person putting this together would say, yeah, there has to be something more out there.
Is the killer still at large? Did he die? Or did he move somewhere else? Still dodging the law and taking innocent lives? This next story takes us to New York City. In 2010, a routine police search on the Long Island beaches uncovered a dumping ground for one of the most gruesome serial killers known to the East Coast.
So far, police have discovered the skeletal remains of 9 and possibly 10 victims on this
remains of 2 more women.
One has the latest shocking find along Ocean Parkway, the second discovery of human remains in just a few hours.
This individual is planning these things out, and that makes him extremely dangerous.
Within a few months, 11 female bodies were found. A creepy similarity with the previous case, isn't it? And it's not just the number. All women were sex workers. Sadly, there's a reason why they are especially targeted by serial killers.
One of the hardest problems for a sexual murderer isn't the abduction, to get a woman, to get a victim to go along with him. In prostitution, that problem is eliminated because prostitutes will go along with anybody. That's part of their job description.
Slowly but surely, the bodies were identified. One of the first ones to be identified was 24-year-old Melissa Barthelemy, Lynn's daughter.
When they found the bodies, we were actually watching TV, and they described, about 5 foot tall, and we looked at each other and just started crying. We knew it was her before we even got the official phone call.
Lynn remembers Melissa as an optimistic, outgoing girl.
Very energetic. She was always happy. She loved to do hair, and she graduated top of her school.
Melissa had grown up in Buffalo and moved to New York City after graduating from high school.
She kind of got hooked. All that fast hustle and bustle, and she was like, wow, I can go down there and I can make a lot of money, and then I can come home and I can open my own salon and buy a house. That was her dream.
Lynn was a bit worried. Melissa was a young, tiny girl with no experience of living in big cities, but this was her dream, and she was an adult. Eager to make quick cash and feeling the pressure of a very expensive city, Melissa turned from stripper to call girl to night worker. She advertised her services on Craigslist. This is the key clue to this case. As police uncovered the tragic stories behind all the victims, they found the Long Island Ripper's MO. He would target escorts on Craigslist.
In many of these cases, there's a symbolic significance to the offender with prostitutes. And in their mind, they sometimes rationalize that they're ridding the world of this type of evil.
Morally, he thinks he's some kind of crusader.
Some of them are hyper-moralistic. And so the prostitute then symbolizes to them fear and anger and all sorts of emotions attached to sexuality.
Tragically, the Long Island serial killer wasn't the first serial killer who targeted prostitutes. Throughout 30 years, Gary Ridgway, or the Green River Killer, killed 48 illegal night workers and was even proud to receive his sentence. Finally, the world knew him for who he was. They recognized his actions. For FBI profilers, these are textbook serial killers. They have two defining traits: narcissism and psychopathy.
Narcissism is somebody who is incredibly egocentric and self-centered, can't get enough of themselves. Psychopathy is a little bit different. That's an individual who has no interpersonal bonding with others.
This means zero empathy. They simply cannot put themselves in someone else's shoes. So they don't have a problem with taking a life, even though they wouldn't want someone to take theirs. Now the FBI had a profile they were looking for, and they could work their way toward narrowing the suspect pool. But try and do that in the Big Apple. It's a needle in a haystack, and apart from being escorts, there was nothing connecting his victims. The only clue the police could work with was a very creepy detail from Melissa's tragic story. After her death, the killer kept her phone. Then, he kept ringing Melissa's sister.
Melissa's missing and we're all worried and freaked out. We haven't heard from her. And Amanda gets this call and caller ID comes up Melissa. And she answers the phone and there's a guy on the other end.
Needless to say, her sister panicked, but she had no idea who this man could be.
I hear a man's voice and I just my whole body shut down, I was just in shock.
And it wasn't just a phone call. He kept calling, to the point where he was harassing her.
How would you describe the conversation?
Playing games with me, pretty much. It was every time my phone would ring, it was him. It was another clue to maybe getting closer to catching him.
He was so confident he would never get caught, he was now getting kicks out of taunting a victim's sister. The more Melissa's sister cried and despaired, the calmer he sounded. During his last call, he admitted to killing Melissa. The police traced one of these calls to central New York, in one of the busiest areas of Manhattan.
Very typical. This is an individual who fits right in. He looks like everybody else. He's not a wild beast that you could recognize as being particularly dangerous.
There was another place the police tracked the killer to. One of his other victims was Shannon Gilbert, another young worker who advertised her services on Craigslist. The last time she was seen alive was on Long Island. She was going to the killer's house. That evening, she made a call to 911, her voice shivering. But the call was made 1 minute too late.
This is the client's house that my sister was last seen at on May 1st.
And it was in here where she made the call to police?
Yes, she first made the phone call to 911 in this house.
What was she saying? What did she say in that call?
She was saying, help me, he's trying to kill me.
It was a very obvious call, and a very dark one indeed. Remember when I said the police were doing a routine check when they discovered all the bodies? They actually decided to do the check after Shannon's terrifying call. They couldn't get to her in time, and they couldn't find her body either. But they figured they might as well make sure the area is safe. If it weren't for Shannon, who knows how many more murders would have happened in Long Island? With the call tracked to the beach house, it seemed like the next logical step is to arrest whoever owned the place. But they did, and they questioned him 3 times, and he was cleared of all charges.
Prayers go out to the families.
So was the neighbor, a retired cop. In fact, everyone who was questioned was cleared of all suspicion. The police kept returning to square one. And there was another problem. The murders had taken place around 1996 and 2010. For over a decade, this killer had kept a secret burial spot that no one knew. And he knew he wasn't going to get caught. But in 2010, when the bodies were uncovered, he knew this was the end, at least for his burial place. Does that mean he fled New York when he saw the news? Is he still out there? With 16 victims uncovered and Shannon's body still missing, the picture is a really gruesome one. It feels like there's more to the Long Island serial killer and that we're so far away from the dark truth of his crimes. Our very last story takes place in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Between February 2007 and August 2008, the police uncovered 13 brutal murders in the area of Carapicuíba. This is a bustling area of nearly 500,000 people, known for parties and a love for freedom. All the murders had taken place around a park, known for illegal night workers and discreet hookups. But there was another catch. The victims were all men, between 20 and 40 years old, and they were all gay. This is why the mysterious killer got nicknamed the Rainbow Maniac by the media. 12 of the 13 men had been shot multiple times, and one of them had passed from repeated blows to the head. And the number is not even final. In a neighboring city, the police found another 3 murders that they thought could be linked to the Rainbow Maniac. But the search for a suspect was truly tedious. Apart from being gay, the victims had nothing in common, and the police simply didn't know where to start when looking for this killer. Finally, on December 10th, 2008, they made an arrest. Former police sergeant Jairo Franco. A witness had come forward saying he'd seen Franco fatally shoot one of the 13 men. After the first witness came others. Some said they had seen Franco in the area known for gay prostitution. However, after hours of questioning and months of investigation, the police concluded there was nothing that could officially link Franco to the murders. In August 2011, Franco was declared not guilty and freed from prison. The mystery remains. Was Franco the murderer? And is he walking free right now because of a breach in the law? Perhaps even corruption, as he was once a sergeant. Or were the police all wrong, and the killer was never even caught? It's a dark and worrying thought that there are so many disturbed individuals out there, including serial killers, who are hiding in plain sight. It's so hard for most people to wrap their head around the thought of actually taking a human life and getting away with it. But there are killers out there who have done just that. In fact, there's some that are on the loose right now. The following stories tell the tale of 3 horrific killers that did unimaginable things. These are people who preyed on the vulnerable, betrayed those who trusted them, and committed some of the most unimaginable acts of evil. One of them was a killer who totally got away and became a celebrity for his crimes, which included eating other people. Another loved to kill women, was released from custody to kill some more. And a third confessed to dozens of shocking murders.
自分がなんでこんなへんてこな妄想を僕だけです。この家族誰もない。だからもしかしたら僕は他の宇宙か次元かからたまたま飛び込んできた隕石のようにガード下に赤ん坊として寝かされていて。
Issei Sagawa was born in April of 1949. He was never a normal person. This man spent his youth dreaming of what it would be like to consume actual flesh. While he was in college, he decided to make his dream become reality. But let's first go back to when Issei was born. He was born in Japan to wealthy parents. He had one brother. His father had a high-power position. While Issei's mother was pregnant with him, she nearly had a miscarriage after a bad fall. He ended up being born premature. He was incredibly small, even fitting into the palm of his parents' hands. He never ended up growing very big. He was very thin and short with small legs. He was well loved by his parents.
何の苦しみも悲しみもなくて、両親も深い愛情で見つめてくれて、広い自然の中で、大切に育てられ、好きな。
Despite his small size, Issei was attracted to taller women with a more Western look. He fantasized about finding what he viewed as the perfect woman. Growing up, Issei wasn't very confident due to his small size, and so he spent a lot of his time reading books. He loved reading so much that he eventually decided to pursue a career in literature. Issei's mother was extremely overprotective of him and sheltered him quite a bit. This could have played a role in his development. Strangely, Issei first found out what cannibalism was when he was just a little boy. As bizarre as it sounds, Issei had an uncle who could celebrate New Year's by dressing up as the cannibal monster that ate little boys. He would terrify Issei by chasing him and his brother around, saying he was going to eat them. Meanwhile, Issei's father would join in on the game by pretending to be a hero that would protect them. Ultimately, the monster would always win, and Issei's uncle would scoop the boys up and lead them over to a giant cooking pot. These games traumatized Issei and affected the rest of his life. As soon as Issei was old enough to read, his favorite types of books were ones that involved people being eaten, either by other people, or monsters, or dragons. Hansel and Gretel was one of his favorites, since it's about a witch that captures and cooks children to eat. He even liked the idea of someone preparing his body to be eaten. He was a smart young boy, and enjoyed school despite being an outcast. The first time he ever thought about wanting to eat someone else was when he was in first grade. He saw a classmate's thigh and thought it looked incredibly tasty. In Issei's household, the topic of intimacy was very taboo, and his parents never discussed it. When his body began changing when he hit puberty, he was terrified because he thought something was wrong with him. His parents had never taught him what to expect about growing up or puberty. Because he didn't understand how intercourse works, he would do a lot of weird, gross things, sometimes involving animals. Once he got a little older, he became infatuated with the female body and read books that discussed it in great detail. At that point, he didn't actually want to kill a woman, he just wanted to chew on one's skin. As disgusting as it sounds, it's believed that cannibalism has actually been going on since way back in history, hundreds of thousands of years ago. In the beginning, it may have started due to a need for food. People may have thought that since an individual was dead, there was no harm in eating their bodies. But today, most people consider cannibalism absolutely horrific and disgusting. It's hard to imagine that anyone would want to do something like that. Most people don't even like to think about it, but not Issei. Issei's fascination with cannibalism was likely connected to some sort of disorder dating back to when he was a child. As an adult, Issei's thoughts of cannibalism were connected to sexual thoughts of women, especially those in the Western world, like Grace Kelly. He loved the thought of eating Grace Kelly.
で、女性に対してはっきりとカニバリズムの妄想を感じたのは小学校4年の時で、非常に奥手で電話をする時も手が震えて吐きそうになりました。でもその子の白いなんとかな太ももスカートから階段を降りる時に見たらやっぱりカニ食べてみたいなっていう。
Eventually, thoughts of violence entered his fantasies. He was obsessed with the thought of killing and eating women. He couldn't even be aroused without thinking about cannibalism and death. He knew that there was something wrong with him. In fact, when he was younger, he actually tried to get himself therapy. He contacted a therapist through the phone, but they would not see him unless he came in person. He was too embarrassed to do that, so he eventually decided that therapy would not be an option for him. It's crazy to think how different his life would have turned out if he had gone through and gotten the help that he needed. When Issei was 24 years old and in college, he began to stalk a German woman. She lived in the same neighborhood as his grandmother and didn't always close her windows during the night. He saw an opportunity and decided to take it. He went to the woman's house and waited outside until he was confident that she was sleeping. He then climbed through the window. His horrific plan was to knock her unconscious with an umbrella and use a knife to cut off a small piece of her body. He would then leave and be able to eat that. But before Issei could attack the woman, he accidentally brushed up against her, waking her up. She saw him and screamed, causing him to run away. In a later interview, Issei said he was charged with attempted assault due to this incident. He didn't tell police what he was really planning to do when he entered the woman's house. Strangely, the charges against Issei were later dropped, and he never had to pay for what he did. Issei would end up completing his master's degree in literature and moving on to a new university in France to get his PhD. Now in Paris, Issei was surrounded by the types of beautiful women he had always fantasized about. On top of that, many of them didn't dress very modestly like the women from back home. It must have seemed like paradise to him. He began finally trying to make his sick dreams a reality by bringing home streetwalkers night after night. His plan was to wait for these women to fall asleep or go to the bathroom, and as soon as they were vulnerable, he would shoot them and eat them. But time after time, he kept losing his nerve and couldn't bring himself to actually do it. There was something in his brain that held him back from pulling the trigger. Deep down, he knew that if he really did it, his life as he knew it would change forever. 2 years after moving to France, Issei would end up meeting a pretty fellow student. Her name was Renee. She was from the Netherlands and had come to Paris to study literature, just like him. He found her stunning and very friendly. He eventually noticed that she would typically ride the same bus home from school that she did. He ended up making chit-chat with her during one of the classes that they shared together, and she brought up the idea of them meeting outside of school at a Greek restaurant, along with other people their age. While he wasn't a very social person, he agreed to go since she was going. While they were out eating, a few of the fellow students talked about how they were interested in trying Japanese food. So Issei offered to host a dinner where he would cook food from home for them. But when the night of the dinner arrived, Renee was the only one that ended up showing up. Issei was caught off guard. He hadn't expected to be alone with her that night, but he couldn't follow through with any of the plans of killing her then because he hadn't prepared himself. So the two chatted and the topic of language came up. Renee revealed that she was fluent in 3 different languages. Issei saw an opportunity and ended up asking Renee if she would tutor him if he paid her. She didn't have much money at the time, so she agreed. The next time that Renee arrived at his house to tutor him, his plan was to kill her. Ultimately, he couldn't do it. He felt like a coward because he just couldn't wrap his head around the idea of taking another person's life. He knew deep down that it was wrong. Renee and Issei started getting closer and closer and would hang out frequently. She would come over to his house all the time to share meals with him and tutor him. He had many opportunities to hurt her, and even though he wanted to, he couldn't, at least not for a while. He would overcome his fears about taking a life in June of 1981. Renee had come over to his house for a German lesson. He decided that was going to be the day that he was finally going to do it. While she was seated at a desk with her back turned, he got up, grabbed his gun, and pointed it at her head. This time, he actually pulled the trigger. But shockingly, the gun misfired, and no bullet came out. Renee hadn't even realized what happened. Issei quickly put his gun down and sat down next to her as if everything was normal. He tried to pretend he was interested in the German lesson she was teaching, despite only using the lesson as a way to get Renee inside of his home. Just 2 days later, Issei invited Renee over again. He told her he needed her help recording some German poetry. She agreed. Just as he had done before, he waited until she was turned around while sitting at the desk, got his gun, and aimed it at her neck. He had finally achieved his dream and had killed her. Renee's body fell to the floor, and she began bleeding. As excitement overcame him, Issei actually fainted. When he came to, he took Renee's clothes off and flipped her body over. He now planned to eat. He bit straight onto her buttocks. His teeth weren't powerful enough to get any meat. None of the knives he had in the house would get the job done either, so he went out and got a big butcher knife. No one walking by his home that night could have ever imagined the horrors that were going on behind closed doors. Issei continued cutting until he found a satisfying chunk to devour raw. Finally, having committed cannibalism, he felt more turned on than ever before. He couldn't stop. For the next several days, he continued to pick. In the days after killing Renee, Issei would leave his home to dispose of all of Renee's clothing except for her pants. He kept those as some sort of sick trophy. Eventually, what was left of Renee began to smell badly and attract flies. so he knew he had to move it before people noticed. He ended up purchasing 2 large suitcases and packing her inside. He then called a taxi to take him to the park. The taxi driver helped him bring the 2 suitcases into the car and even commented on the fact that they were really heavy and made a joke suggesting Issei had a body in there. He played it off and said that it was just books inside. Issei took the suitcases to a beautiful lake where he planned to push them out onto the water where they would sink. What he didn't anticipate was that there would be so many people around. They were laying by the water and sunbathing. He couldn't do what he needed to do with all of them watching, so he just kept walking around. He eventually found a slope where he thought he would be able to push the suitcases down to the water without anyone noticing, but they were so heavy and he eventually had to take a break. A man walking by saw what he was doing and confronted him. He asked him what was inside of the suitcases and eventually opened one himself to find out. He was shocked to discover severed feet and what he could tell was part of a woman's body. As soon as he made the discovery, Issei fled the scene. The man screamed out to the people gathered nearby, saying that this man was a murderer. They called the police, who were eventually able to track him down. When they later went to his house, they found pieces of a woman in his refrigerator. He admitted to what he had done and told them that he suffered from mental illness. Issei was brought before a judge and made to explain in detail what he did to Renee. The judge heard his story and found him to be too crazy to actually stand trial. So, instead of being sent to prison, he was sent to a mental asylum where he spent 2 years. The people of France were not very happy that the country was paying money to house a killer that wasn't even from France, and they began to express their displeasure. Meanwhile, Issei's father, who had lots of wealth and power, was formulating a deal with France that would allow his son to be sent back to Japan to live in a mental institution there. France, eager to do whatever it took to get this person out of their country, agreed to the deal. Part of this involved France dropping the charges against him. Issei was sent back home to Japan, and when he arrived at the mental hospital, he was evaluated by a doctor. The doctor quickly came to the conclusion that Issei was, although disturbed, mentally stable. He believed that he certainly belonged behind bars. But at this point, since France had dropped the charges, there was nothing that Japan could do to bring him to justice for the horrific things he had done. He was freed and eventually released from the hospital, never having to pay for his crimes. Now, living as a free man, Issei was very low on money.
でそういうふうにもう仕事もなくなってもうないですから収入もないよ。
One day, he ended up being contacted by a local newspaper asking him to write a piece covering a story about a sadist having been recently captured and apprehended. Because Issei was pretty famous at that point for what he had done, they probably expected the article to do quite well, and it did. He ended up making quite a bit of money. As if that wasn't disturbing enough, he was also contacted by another company who asked him to write a comic book about his experience. His book, which is literally about killing and eating a woman, did tremendously well and sold thousands of copies. Issei would end up publishing many other books and continue to become more and more famous. He would even end up being invited to join a prestigious painting club where he would paint lots of pictures of women. He was even invited to be a part of a film. You're probably thinking about how disgusting it is that an incredibly evil killer not only avoided justice, but made a profit off of it. It may help you to know that his money eventually ran out, landing him once again in poverty. He ended up needing welfare.
どうやって滞納してますから、いつ追い出されるかわからない。ここ追い出されたら僕は死ぬしかないと思ってるんで、いつ死ぬかわからないから、だから生きてる間は嗅ぎつけようと思って。
On top of this, he ended up struggling with health problems and requiring full-time caregivers. He is now 73 and claims he regrets his past decisions. He will die a slow, agonizing, and painful death due to his conditions. This one's about Pedro Lopez, monster of the Andes. Pedro Lopez of Colombia was born in 1949. At the time, the country was plagued by riots and violence. A popular political leader had been assassinated and a civil war broke loose throughout the country. It was not the time where you would want to be living in Colombia. Pedro was the son of a poor streetwalker. He was the 7th of 13 children. Growing up, his life was very hard. His mother was incredibly overbearing and controlling, but his life was still better at home than it would have been on the streets, where crime was taking over more than ever before. Pedro's life within the safety of his own home would not last long. When he was just 8 years old, his mother walked in on him having relations with his younger sister. She was furious and kicked him out of his own home, telling him never to return again. Pedro walked down the streets alone with nowhere to go, when all of a sudden he was approached by an older man who said he could take care of him. Pedro accepted the offer with the hopes of being taken to an actual home with food and a place to sleep. Instead, he was taken to an abandoned building where the man took advantage of him several times before throwing him back out on the streets. Scarred by this interaction, Pedro then became terrified by strangers. He spent his days sleeping during the comfort of the day and begging or searching for dumpsters for food at night. One day, an American couple happened to notice his disturbingly thin features and decided to take him in. They gave him food and a place to stay and eventually enrolled him in a local school. While they probably felt like they were doing the best thing for him, he ended up getting assaulted by one of his teachers, running away and returning to the streets. Pedro had very little education and didn't really have any trades, which made it difficult for him to find a job. He would get money through begging and stealing. Eventually, stealing caught up to him after he stole a car and he was sentenced to life in prison. He was only in jail for a couple of days before being violently assaulted by a group of older inmates. It was then that Pedro promised himself that nobody would ever hurt him again. He fashioned weapons that he found in prison and killed each man that hurt him, earning only a 2-year longer sentence and losing most of the sanity that he had left. Pedro blamed his mother for everything that had happened in his life and wanted revenge. After he was released from prison, he would later admit to stalking and killing around 100 young girls around Peru. At one point, he was actually caught by a tribe of men and tortured for his attempt to hurt a young girl. They planned to kill him by burying him alive in sand, but a Christian missionary ended up saving his life by convincing them to turn him over to authorities instead. He would be forced to return to Colombia, where his murderous rampage continued. At one point, Pedro went into a grocery store and tried to kidnap a young girl who was with her mother shopping. Grocery store workers helped the girl's mom and chased him down. He was eventually taken into custody. While Pedro was behind bars, he declined to answer police questions. They ended up having a local priest dress up in prison guard clothing to try to see if he could get some answers out of him. Sure enough, Pedro was only too eager to discuss his crimes. Pedro eventually admitted to having murdered hundreds of girls across multiple countries.
I like the girls in Ecuador. They are more gentle and trusting, more innocent. They are not as suspicious of strangers as Colombian girls.
Pedro blamed his crimes on his tough childhood, claiming he found the need to find revenge on others because of what he experienced when he was only 8 and was kicked out of his home. He wanted to hurt as many girls as he could. He loved searching for his young female women during the light of day and would capture them at night. He would then strangle them to death while taking advantage of them. He loved watching the light in their eyes go out. This not only caused him arousal, but deep pleasure as he came to experience the death of so many innocent girls who were completely defenseless. It would be years before he was finally brought behind bars and made to pay for his crimes. Despite the fact that Pedro had admitted to killing many young girls, the legal system still ended up coming up with a deal that benefited him. They told him as long as he could provide them with the location of some of his young victims, they would reduce his sentence. He agreed, and shortly, after more than 50 of his young female victims' remains were found. The victims ranged in age from 8 through 12 years old. Pedro was then charged with many counts of murder. Pedro was later convicted and sentenced to life in jail, but he ended up getting released towards the end of 1998. Even upon his release, Pedro was absolutely obsessed with the thought of killing women and watching life leave their eyes. It gave him such a sense of power and longing. He absolutely loved the process of killing innocent women because they knew no better and simply had no way of defending themselves. He only enjoyed avoid this killing experience if he could truly watch the girl pass away. Eventually, Pedro was arrested as an illegal immigrant and determined insane. Unfortunately, he ended up paying bail and getting released, free to continue the harm of others until the day of his death. This is the strange story of Alexander Pushkin, a heartless killer. He was born in Moscow in April of 1974. His early life was relatively normal from a freak accident that happened when he was young. He was injured while playing on a swing and hit his head, resulting in a brain injury. It is believed that his prefrontal cortex was damaged as a result of this injury. This part of the brain helps moderate aggression and impulsivity. This accident very well could have impacted the rest of his life and contributed to the horrific killer that he would later become. Because Alexander was just a young child when this accident occurred and he had such little padding in his head, it affected him far more than it would have if he was an adult. His life changed dramatically. He had to be switched out of his normal school and attend one that was for children with disabilities. He became aggressive, angry, and hostile. He was bullied by other children because of his mental problems. Despite Alexander's disability, he was an intelligent child, something that his grandfather recognized. Alexander's grandfather felt that his grandson's new school was far too obsessed with overcoming his disability than actually learning and fostering his intelligence. Eventually, he would take Alexander in to live with him. Alexander's grandfather wanted him to focus on learning new skills and taking interests in things outside of school. He taught him many things, one of which was how to play chess. He was shockingly good, despite his young age, and would often play against grown men. For a while, things in his life greatly improved as he had finally found something he enjoyed and was passionate about. Playing chess also helped him get his aggression back under control. Unfortunately, Alexander's grandfather would eventually pass away, and he would begin to struggle again. He was still getting bullied by mainstream children because of his disability, and he had to be moved back home to live with his mother again. As a way of trying to cope with the pain, not only of losing his beloved grandfather and the bullying, Alexander started drinking a lot of liquor. He would spend his time playing chess with older men and drinking. At this point, Alexander had begun some violent tendencies. Whenever he would come into contact with young children, he would threaten them while recording the whole thing on video. This made him feel more in control and powerful. By 1992, he was already on a murder rampage. He killed his own classmate with a hammer and buried his body. His next victim was a man who was dating a girl named Olga, someone that he was romantically interested in that had rejected him. Alexander made the man's death appear as an accident. After a long break, Alexander began killing again in 2001. His next kill began with a casual game of chess in the park with a 52-year-old man. Alexander lured the man into the woods, claiming that he wanted to visit the location of his dog's burial site in honor of the anniversary of the dog's death. But Alexander would ultimately use a bottle of vodka to strike him in the head and kill him. He then buried the body in a well. Between 2001 and 2005, Alexander attacked a whopping 36 victims. Only a few survived. Some of them he didn't even bother to properly bury or dispose of. He used a vodka bottle to kill and maim many of his victims. He would later say that killing others made him feel powerful, and as if he was God. Alexander's murder spree would come to an end in 2006 after a particularly bold killing. He convinced one of his co-workers, a girl named Marina, to go for a walk with him. Marina agreed to go, but she had a bad feeling about it. She even left a note behind for her son that said where she was going and who she was going with. It also had Alexander's phone number on it. Alexander knew that she had left the note, but it didn't hold him back from taking her life. Her body was later found in the park, where Alexander would often play chess. The police looked at surveillance footage from the metro and were able to see Alexander and Marina together, and he was arrested. While in custody, he ended up confessing to many of his other murders, and even helped lead police to where some of the bodies were located. You'll be relieved to know that, unlike the other killers on this list, Alexander is not on the loose. But his crimes were so horrific that we felt we had to include him on this list. He ended up being convicted of 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. Shockingly, he ended up asking the court to add 11 more victims to his conviction, bringing his murder count up to 60. A judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and with the first 15 years spent in solitary confinement. It was deemed that Alexander was evil, but not mentally ill, and was fit to serve his sentence. Today he is 48 and remains behind bars where he will stay until the day of his death.